Hello, everyone. As you are joining in, feel free to get settled. You should be able to see me in one screen, and in the greater screen are slides. Additionally, to the right-hand panel, if this is one of your first times attending a session with a big marker, you'll notice some features that you'll want to take advantage of. One is the handouts. The first one is meant for note-taking, either physically or digitally. We'll partake in some polls as well that I'll make live as we need them. If you have questions during our sessions, feel free to post them in the Q&A, and then we just have our general public chat as well. All right, and then Dr. Piñon, I think maybe let's wait one more minute. I can see some more attendees joining, so I want to make sure they get a moment as well.
Sounds good.
For those of you just joining us, I'd like to call your attention to the side panel of your screen. You should be able to see a couple of important features to enhance our time together today. The very last one to the right side is called Handouts, and the very first one you can use for your note-taking, if you so desire, either digitally or physically. A couple other items that may be helpful for you that you can download. During our time, periodically, we'll have a couple of polls, so I'll make those available as needed. And of course, we want all of your questions and hope to provide some answers. So we have that Q&A feature and then the general public chat as well. We also have some tech support as needed, and then Dr. Piñon as well to support our time together. There'll be, depending on our time and the flow of our session, about 5 or 6 opportunities for breakout sessions. And so we'll take a look at how many we have total that are joining us today so that we can create those groups if needed.
Well, welcome to our Translanguaging for Social Justice strand. My name is Dr. Liz Piñon, and I'm part of IDRA. I'm an education associate, and I'm so happy you're joining us here today. I'm very humbled that we have an amazing speaker today. Our session today, titled Translanguaging Policies and Practices for Dual Language Programs, is going to be presented by Dr. Alejandra Babino, and she's an associate professor of bilingual ESL education at Texas A&M University in Commerce. And she has won multiple awards for her teaching and research in bilingual education. Before working full-time in higher education, she was a high school teacher, a Spanish teacher, elementary dual language teacher, gifted and talented specialist, and advanced academics coordinator. Her recently published book, Radicalizing Literacies and Languaging, captures her work at the intersection of literacy and bilingual education as a second-generation Mexican American. While she's held many titles over the year, at heart she'll always be a maestra that teaches with cariño and todo corazón. I'm so excited to have you joining us, Dr. Babino.
Thank you, Dr. Piñon. I'm glad to be here. And like Dr. Piñon shared, so much of what we'll get to talk through today is lived experience, both as a bilingual person, but also as a bilingual teacher and someone who currently prepares future and in-service bilingual teachers. So if this sounds good to you, you're in the right place. By way of reminder, the nitty-gritty of what oops, I'm hearing that someone can't hear me. Is everyone else able to hear me? Dr. Piñon? Dr. Pignon, oh yeah, okay, Zulema, thank you so much. So a little nitty gritty to make sure you're in the right place, though of course I want you to enjoy this as much as possible. Our primary goal would be to reflect on the many benefits of translanguaging. But before we do, we really need to define what is translanguaging. And we'll talk about translanguaging over 5 dimensions. We'll use this as a firm foundation that'll allow us to practice and discuss some possible dual language translanguaging policies and then particular practices as well. So after trying those out in our breakout groups, you'll also have the opportunity to make an action plan depending on your context and your role that you can take back with you. So as a teacher, over the course of my career, my heartbeat has always been probably the same as yours. And that is, how can I make the maximum positive impact on my students? I have no doubt we all have positive intent. Our positive intent is at 100%, but our impact is so variable, and I think dependent on the way we're able to be reflexive in critical communities through critical friendships. So as part of that greater mission, we're looking to answer the question, how can we leverage translanguaging practices and policies for educational equity? And I think that's the key phrase, for educational equity. So to help us achieve these goals, I am going to invite us to grapple with translanguaging pedagogy. And I say grapple because I want us to interact mind, body, soul, and spirit with our personal and professional experiences with translanguaging pedagogy to see how these policies and practices might be a right fit for your context. Allowing us to do that, we'll discuss and read about some critical components of translanguaging pedagogy, but really spend our time at the end writing out some translanguaging practices that you'll take back with you. So to give us an overview of our time together, we'll start off with some introductions, both you and a little bit deeper about me. We'll set the foundation of background knowledge that I believe will help us more fully receive the truly robust potential of translanguaging pedagogy. Then we'll learn about and try out in breakout groups varying translanguaging policies and practices before creating your action plan. But before we do, we're going to start off with some permission slips. Do we have anybody here who is a Brené Brown fan? Little bit fangirl. She wrote, and I think one of her recent books in 2019 about the practice of including permission slips. And ever since, I've used these permission slips when discussing what could be challenging topics, especially in relation to equity and justice in education. So I'd like to present these before us to consider, especially how it relates to translanguaging pedagogy, and invite us to think which ones are our natural strengths, as well which one we might be holding up for ourselves to focus on today. So the first one is understanding that you have a unique perspective, which means you may understand some things and be an expert, but also can learn from others. This is definitely a foundational belief for myself when coming up against translanguaging pedagogy. My personal bilingual experiences are different than many of the originators of the theories and practices. And so I had to stop and think, okay, what do they know? What are they experts on that can teach me? But dually, also, what do I know from my bilingual experiences that can help us stretch and texturize our understandings of translanguaging? Some of you may be readily able and willing to hold on to translanguaging pedagogy, but some may be a little resistant. And so I'd like to invite us to listen to an idea all the way through before making a judgment, and to consider how we can listen to an idea without having our current beliefs threatened. So, okay, I hear that. I hear that all the way through, and I still believe what I believe. Additionally, and I would argue is the crux of our work, working towards educational equity, is caring about others, and out of that care, seeking to understand and empathize with our students' experiences, even if we don't completely understand it. For those of us that are part of the communities that we teach, so for example, if we're Latinx and we teach Latinx students, or if we're Asian American and teach Asian American students, sometimes there are natural connections we have with them, but other times there's also unexamined assumptions that we don't even realize are there. Furthermore, we want to keep in mind of the beauty and the goodness of being committed to viewing multiple perspectives, which relates to our first one, and thinking about how our positionalities help us understand and process, as well as experience these theories. Also important is that our ideas and beliefs can change, and that's okay. Pretty darn sure for the last 9 years since I've been writing publicly, almost every time after I publish an article, there's something in there I don't believe anymore. Even our book that Dr. Babino talked about, I'm like, I've grown since then, and that's only been a couple of years. Furthermore, some topics are hard and unsettling, and it's okay to acknowledge that. We can experience a strong emotion and give ourselves space to investigate why. In our introductions, I'll get to share how translanguaging was something that I had very strong emotions around. And so I've had to give myself place as a bilingual teacher of bilingual students to explore, why am I feeling that way? And then lastly, but in no way least, to remember that we're all on a journey. So some of you may feel like near experts in translanguaging, and others may be just beginning their journey. And we all have a place here today. So with that in mind, oops, got a little too excited. I'd like to invite you at this time to pick one that you'll be holding to for yourself. For me personally, I think I want to hold on to being committed to viewing multiple perspectives, especially considering all the language groups and language practices we may have represented today. Okay, so now for real, we'll get to do a little of our introductions. Now in here, it says we're going to use Menti, but really we're going to use the polls that we have. So with that, I'm going to start. You should see it pop up on your screen. If you don't, please let me know in the chat and we will get that to go. Yes. So Rita, does that mean yes, you can see it? I think that means yes. Oops, sorry, that was something else.
Yeah, it's on. It's perfect.
Thank you. Okay, so mostly bilingual life. All right. Yeah, there have been times in my life, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, where it's been one language is more dominant, others are more mixed. I would say now is more mixed. So that's helpful. All right, perfect. Now a little bit about me. I know Dr. Pignon shared a little bit, but I think this is important because we have to situate ourselves and how we understand and practice translanguaging, especially in regards to how we implement it for equity for our students. So to get us started, I think it's helpful to start how I find myself in relation to translanguaging is that I started off my life as what some in early childhood call a first language bilingual, or I have two first languages. And so a lot of times in bilingual education, both practice and research, you see these labels like, what's your first language? What's your dominant language? What's your home language? And a lot of those labels didn't fit because it wasn't just one language, or the two languages that I started my life with weren't the languages I would continue to be quote unquote dominant in later in life. Now, there was for sure a flashpoint, pretty defining moment in my early childhood life, which I think is totally typical for students of color, as well as other marginalized communities. At the age of 4 or 5, I misraced a boy at school. And so what I mean is that I saw a brown boy and I started speaking Spanish to him. And what my mom tells me is that he like totally me regañó, and I stopped speaking Spanish after that. I misraised him, I got it wrong, and as a little perfectionist at the time, did not want to keep making that mistake. But that was so impactful that I spent most of my early life, you can see here, about 5 to 12 years old, in a pretty English monolingual community. In this place, my mom's Mexican and my dad is estadounidense, bien pelirrojo, so I look way more like him. And so when I experienced language and culture, they were pretty bifurcated. There was the English space and the Spanish space. In particular, my mom did as well. She's what can be considered 1.5 generation. So she came to the US when she was 4 years old. So she has the life before the US, but grew up here enough that she's pretty acclimated to the US culture. So they had this rule at home that was puro español, like here we only speak Spanish. And that carried over into our family life and how we navigated our languages and cultures. Now, like many second generation Mexican Americans and of other ethnicities as well, I spent most of my middle grades in high school and beginning college life reclaiming Spanish as a heritage language. Some people in bilingual education find heritage language speaker to be a dirty word, and there's total legitimate reasons for that. For me personally, it fits pretty well because there's two key determinants of a heritage speaker. First is your family's connection, and I totally relate to the cultural pieces as well as some of the language elements of the Spanish language. But also, there is the distinct experience of almost like this struggle, this battle between the languages and your identities. And as my comadre and I share at the beginning of our book, when I think about my bilingual biliteracy journey, it is marked by constant anxiety of not being Mexican enough, of totally being red white, like I understand, but my experience is not being completely white. So there's this term that has been so impactful for me, and we'll really talk through when it relates to translanguaging policies and practices, is marginal whiteness, how you can be marginalized, but at the same time experience the benefits from whiteness. So my family, both first and second generation, experienced a lot of the effects through our proximity to whiteness. About 21 to 27 years old, I was becoming and being a bilingual teacher, really getting to use both languages all the time, and maybe even Spanish the majority of the time. I felt like my identities really solidified, but they were also solidified because I saw how not just similar I was with my students, but how different. Them being first generation instead of second generation, them being what might be called like working class instead of lower middle class, like I grew up, them being racialized as immigrants, and myself usually being racialized as white. And so I found that the more I learned of who they were, I learned what was a benefit for me linguistically in school wasn't necessarily the same for them. And so again, how we talk about it in our book is that we walked these ideas out in love for 15 years before we ever started to formally talk about them and write about them. So really the last 10 years, not 10 years, a little before the current stage, is starting to move away from having separate places for language. I forgot to mention, because I had so much anxiety as a second generation Mexican American, I thought the way to legitimize my identity was to learn as much Spanish as I could and to learn the quote unquote right Spanish, right? But in reality, I saw that if I only focused on Spanish development, that the students wouldn't necessarily have educational equity if they didn't also have access to the English language development. And even more importantly, something that was drastically missing from my experiences, and that was the place for bilingual identity development, of that healing and hopeful integration of the two. So as I continued through graduate school, I still was focused on protecting and prioritizing Spanish development. But then I also saw the need for translanguaging policies and practices. Now, for real, the past 10 years or so, I've been refining my understanding of translanguaging policies and practices, especially as they relate to sociolinguistic ideologies, or the beliefs that people have with the co-naturalization or the co-creation of race and language. Seeing how that's affected my students and myself, not just in the classroom, but also at the university level. So I share this story, not just because I like to hear myself talk, but more importantly is that I hope it serves as a heuristic where you can see yourself, both in how our stories converge, but perhaps just as importantly, how our stories diverge and are different, because they for sure affect the way that we believe language should be used, what's considered quote unquote good language, and how we teach and lead as educators. So here, there's some pretty core beliefs that we find over the story of my life. First, like I mentioned, languages and cultures reside in separate people. The Spanish place, the English place. There's the estadounidense, there's the Mexicano. And even myself, I would experience, okay, this is the Mexico-Americana alley, and this is, the white passing English alley. So there were different times for each language. Also, because I grew up in an English dominant community, and I think I'm racialized as white, Spanish was always seen as a benefit. My tios and mom always talked about how their bilingualism helped them as first generation immigrants in the United States. Because I was in a white dominant area, being Mexican American for me was seen as exotic. It's something that's different. And I saw that Spanish was part of something that makes you a quote unquote good Mexican or a good American. And so if I didn't have that, I wouldn't be a good Mexican or Mexican American. Now, to be sure, I do not really believe that now, but this is some of our implicit or unconscious beliefs, right? So these aren't just inconsequential beliefs. They had real effects in how I taught as a bilingual teacher. First, I was super sure to separate times. This is English time, and I'm not going to mention a word of Spanish. This is Spanish time, and I'm not going to mention a word of English. So much so that when I was the Spanish dual language teacher, I had a student that said, "Miss Babino, I had no idea you speak English so well," because the teacher had come in that was a monolingual English speaker, and so he had never heard me utter a word of English. And I'm like, "Oh, thank you, Freddie. It's actually my dominant language." And so I wasn't bringing my full self and wasn't in turn encouraging full and integrated bilingual identities. Oh, this, my friends, is probably one of the most unintentionally hurtful effects that I had. I would say that I believe that maintaining Spanish would always lead to bilingual immigrants' educational success, because mine led to success. I also found it quote unquote easy to be proud to be Mexican American. Like I shared earlier, developing Spanish legitimizes our Mexican Americanness, and principally that Spanish can be lost so quickly that we need to privilege and protect it. So what happened when it comes to translanguaging? Kind of intimated it earlier. I was reluctant because I didn't grow up in a bilingual community. I had super separated places. I forgot to say, out of the 10 nietos from my abuelos that came to the United States, only 2 of us are bilingual in the second generation. So that means 8 out of the 10 as second generation Mexican Americans do not speak Spanish. And I didn't want that for my students. Furthermore, as a 4th grade bilingual teacher, I was the pure Spanish bilingual teacher, and I started noticing them rejecting speaking Spanish in class. And I'm like, your parents and your family speak Spanish at home. You've been in dual language since pre-K. Why are you fighting this? You know, I had also been taught from my family, which I have to say, I no longer believe, that people code switched because it was easier or it was just more comfortable for them. But most importantly for me at the time, I was reluctant towards translanguaging pedagogy because I was worried it wouldn't ultimately lead to linguistic justice or linguistic equity for students. Because I experienced personally how I benefited from learning standardized Spanish and standardized English. I had scholarships that were available and career opportunities that were available. So I felt like, hey, like I would almost be a hypocrite if I said they didn't need these language forms when I know that they did provide some pretty material benefits to myself. So once again, we're going to do another check-in. Now that you've heard my story, hopefully you see yourself both where we align and maybe have some important differences. Not going to use Menti. We're going to use the poll here since it's a little bit easier. 2 questions, and I'll post them in a second. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being low and 10 being high, how would you rate your understanding of translanguaging? Would you say, I know the definitions, I can talk about it, I use it this way, this way, this way? I would say that would be a 10. 1 or 2, brand spanking new. Maybe 3, 4, and 5, I've heard about it. 6, 7, 8, 9, I've heard about it. I can explain to you what it is, and I'm in different stages of implementing it in the classroom. Then, just as important, on a scale of 1 to 10, again, I'll post these in a little bit, what are your feelings regarding translanguaging? Like, not a big deal, like a 1, or 10, it is absolutely transformative. You need this for everybody. I'm going to post those in just a second. So I think I just posted the second poll first, absolutely, or accidentally. How do you feel about translanguaging? Ooh, I like what I'm seeing, and I'll definitely share it with you. Okay, I see 17 responses. I want to make sure everyone's represented. Dr. Piñon, do you know how many participants we have? I'm afraid if I go out of this view, I'm going to miss somebody.
28.
Thank you. So I'll keep that marker. I appreciate that. So in the chat, Jose is saying each of us have a personal journey that brings unique perspectives and enhances our collective understanding. Yes, 1000%. And I think it helps us understand, right, where we each fall and what equity looks like for each context. Because what equity perhaps looked like for me, for my journey, wasn't what worked for my students 20 years ago, or isn't what works for pre-service teachers, right? And then Dr. Piñon shares about her mom's experiences as a dual language educator in Chicago and how they only spoke Spanish at home. Oh, and she saw how she transferred it into the classroom. So I want to say there is no shame. There is no shame here. Just understanding that I hope propels us forward. Okay, so I'm looking at our responses. And I saw most feel like they have a pretty good, they have positive feelings towards dual language, which is great. Our next one, the understanding. So this helps me know how much to contextualize at the beginning, whether to move forward, stay a little bit, and I'll be checking in with you in our time today as well. So, all right, so far 7 responses. I'll wait till we get 20-ish to make sure everybody's represented. I forgot to mention, we will have a planned break in the middle of our time. I've heard some people call these biological breaks, and I just think that's brilliant. So we will take a biological break about halfway through our session. All right, getting closer, their poll. So it sounds like most of us have pretty positive feelings towards translanguaging, so I don't gotta convince you. Maybe I overcompensate because of my own experiences, and I totally confess to that. All right, we're up to 22, we have 28. So far, understanding is 5 and up. So we have 6 people at 5 and 6, 7 people at a level 7 of understanding, 3 at a level 8, 6 at a level 9, 5 at a level 10. All right, we're good to go. This is fascinating and so exciting for me. Great. Okay. So with that, some background knowledge. Now I know I can pretty much move pretty quickly because I really, really do want to make sure that we spend half of our time engaging in practice of these policies and practices. For me, what makes translanguaging pedagogy transformative, and I also think how you can convince your leaders, like at the district level, is that it's based in humanizing pedagogies, and especially with the increase of focus on the whole child and more specifically social and emotional learning. I think if we can connect it here, we're more likely to get buy-in, especially from those that are a little more reluctant towards translanguaging pedagogy. Of course, we have to talk a little bit more about language ideologies and how those affect our language policies. But even more than that, it's like, what is language and how does translanguaging transform our ideas about language as a thing, but also language practices, and then compare it with probably how we were taught for those of you that have partaken in bilingual teacher preparation programs, and maybe even professional development, how translanguaging theory contrasts a lot of the seminal or classic theories we were exposed to. So by humanizing pedagogy, what do I mean? It means pretty simply focusing on the whole person. It focuses on honoring their thoughts, their experiences, but also their ability to grow. Because of this, we want to focus on agency by giving students choices, and translanguaging pedagogy allows for that. So thinking, how can I convince our leaders? Point, right? It also highlights dialogue. And so a lot of times this might be represented in the classroom by saying, giving some feedback and saying, what do you think about this? Or is that what you see? A really typical everyday way I try to highlight that is in quote unquote grading or feedback in classwork, of saying like giving narrative feedback, using a rubric and saying, as always, if you see this differently, please feel free to email me if you feel like I didn't accurately represent your knowledge or your work here. And so it's kind of always leaving it open of like a volley back and forth to talk through things. And as a result, it focuses on relationships with, like we see here, opportunities to receive feedback, but then create drafts. And so it's creating multiple opportunities to create work, get feedback that's open-ended, produce work again, get feedback that's open-ended, and talk through that to continually grow. Equally as important, I think humanizing pedagogy grapples with hard histories and current circumstances that threaten our students and our own humanity. This is the second time we've heard the word grapple. And again, what I love about it is that I picture it involving all of ourselves, of this push and pull of holding on to our values with everything swirling around us that's quite frankly, pushing us in a current of the opposite direction of what might be humanizing. Now, is that not the greatest understatement of like the past, I don't know how many years in education? So translanguaging is for sure connected to and embodies a lot of the facets of humanizing pedagogy. In translanguaging, it's also an ideology or a language belief. Just we all have attitudes, opinions, beliefs about language. And importantly, even institutions have these attitudes, opinions, and beliefs about language. They have opinions about what language is, how it should be used, who should use it, and even multilingual students as parallel monolinguals, or as Jean Grosjean says, two monolinguals as one. So we're expecting their English to be like an English monolingual speaker, and we're expecting their Spanish or other language to be like a monolingual other language speaker, when really it's a super dynamic process. And of course, we see it through what we mentioned earlier, racial-linguistic ideologies or beliefs regarding how we race language and language race. This is important as we talk about translanguaging, but just as important is thinking about what is language. Pretty typically throughout US education, language has been used prescriptively. If this is the concrete, perfect little language that we're learning, that we're trying to transmit to students. It's prescriptive. We focus on what should be done. However, linguistic research has a history of descriptive language. We're not judging language. We're not saying what's more important. We're just describing what is. So a perfect example of this is prescriptive language is what's the best bilingual look like, and writing down all of these qualifications. Where a descriptive perspective might be like, what is the experience of this bilingual population and this bilingual population? We're not trying to say one is more ideal. We're just describing it and responding to that. Of course, translanguaging looks at language as changing and ever moving instead of a static object. Just talked about that. Translanguaging also focuses on people instead of the language. What do people do? How do people practice language? And it doesn't have so much of a distinction between academic language and social language. Instead, like Nelson Flores talks about, is that there's a complex linguistic architecture where the academic and the social are all constructed intricately together. And the same for formal and informal. For instance, in a presentation, we may think of formal language, but at this time, I'm probably using what may be considered some features of formal language, but also features of informal language. So we can see already how we've probably been taught language, how we currently teach language, and even how we want to increasingly more teach language practices. How it's usually used in school, Guadalupe Valdez from Stanford says that language is curricularized, that we make it into a curriculum that we teach prescriptively because it's one static object with one perfect view of what it means to learn a language, with a distinct focus on academic language and formal registers of language, all for the purpose of creating what Nelson Flores talks about, the ideal neoliberal subject. And what do we mean by that? It means getting the best education we can so that you can get the best job you can to be competitive in the global market. Does that sound familiar? That was for sure a large part of the ideologies I was taught in my first generation family. And it was for sure the predominant perspective of my bilingual teacher preparation program of let's focus on all the benefits of bilingualism. Now, to be fair, to put it in historical context, it makes sense when you're fighting for the right to have language as a resource that you would need to talk about it in ways that lead to interest convergence with the dominant population. So to say, but we really want bilingual programs because it will increase achievement. It will increase positive identities. They have more creative processing. So it makes sense when we look at it in history why we would push such a neoliberal view of the benefits of bi and multilingualism. At the same time, what does it mean if we only or predominantly focus on bi and multilingualism as a neoliberal goal, or in order to get the benefits, to be and have the best job possible, to get the most money possible? I would argue that that's severely and grossly dehumanizing, because it's reducing our languages, our cultures, our communities to economic material means. So I want to be even humanizing in my critique of that, to place it in its history and the fight for bilingual education with the benefits that have legitimized it. At the same time, we problematize only or mostly focusing on those benefits. So you were here because you want to know, what do we do? A lot of you had your understanding of translanguaging at a 5 to a 10. So what do? We look at our own language ideologies or our beliefs, and more particularly, Flores and Rosa, you've heard them a couple times already now, recommend that we have a critical heteroglossic perspective. And what they mean by that is heteroglossic mixed. We should have a pretty multidimensional understanding of what language is, as not just an object, but a set of practices that can change within a person and in different communities and contexts. By critical, they mean we should ask questions about it. They mean we should consider what's considered legitimate language practices and illegitimate language practices, as well as be connected to critical theories that focus on the ultimate educational equity of students. And then instead, because we're looking at language as many different practices, we can look at language such as what tends to be described as BICS and CALPS, or academic and interpersonal, formal or informal, as a complex linguistic architecture that is all connected intricately. And as teachers, educators, and leaders, no matter what our title is, we can systematize space that affirms all of these complex linguistic features and sustains them, all different forms and languages, so that we teach them the many forms, as well as provide them space to critique the language forms. And this, my friends, I think is what makes this potentially transformative, what makes it humanizing, because we honor what's already there, we encourage growth, we give them tools to create the futures that they want for themselves. And we'll talk about practical ways to do that in school systems in a little bit. Now, the last piece of foundational knowledge, I promise, before we move into the practice, is how translanguaging contrasts with Seminal research. In other words, what we were probably taught in our teacher preparation programs, and maybe even is still used in some professional development today. Most of us probably grew up with a common underlying proficiency, that there's a base of language understanding that helps us. What you know in one language can be transferred into another language with the interdependence hypothesis. What we're able to express at the top, the iceberg theory, is just a small percentage of everything we know. The threshold hypothesis, which you see depicted here, that if you have a little bit of understanding in your quote unquote first language, you're probably not going to experience many cognitive benefits. If you have a little bit more understanding in 2 of your languages, you may have some benefits. You may not have benefits. But really, quote unquote, balanced bilinguals are the goal, is when you have relatively equal levels of proficiency in your languages. And here we see a pretty distinct separation between BICS and CALP that I think to this day I've found myself misusing as well. Yes, so I'm seeing someone saying in the chat, but pre-service teachers need to pass their bilingual test to become certified. Oh, yes. So I'm sorry I'm backing up a little bit, but absolutely. So I think that's why we have space to affirm and sustain many language forms totally in Spanish. And that's why I think equity looks different for each language population, for each person, and in each context, right? So I agree with you as teacher educators. What my translanguaging pedagogy looks like when I only have 3 bilingual classes to prepare students for the BTLPT looks distinct. And I think having this more complex understanding of translanguaging pedagogy connected to equity and humanizing pedagogy helps us have a framework where we can more accurately and robustly truly achieve our aims for equity. Because is it really equity if you create all this translanguaging space and then they can't pass the BTLPT? I think quite a few bilingual researchers would say no. All right. So some things to consider with our seminal theories that somewhat contrast translanguaging theory and pedagogy is that it's pretty theoretical. It's not based on so much actual studies and its conceptualization. Furthermore, Colin Baker in his seminal text say balanced bilinguals don't actually exist. We all use our languages with different people, places, and purposes. So it's super rare to be a balanced bilingual, but even in our goals for students, I think we can still strive towards developing language practices and language proficiencies without having a hurtful ideal of a balanced bilingual. Some researchers critique these seminal theories because they say there's not really a focus on the sociocultural factors that make an incredible difference on how we learn and use our languages. But what is helpful for them is that they are classic. They are something that have endured the test of time in a way, and they do relate and acknowledge certain factors like the cognitive language and academic development across 2 languages. So what is translanguaging? We probably mostly hear about it as a pedagogy, but a little bit of history is equally as important. It is based on the social reality of how multilingual people across the world actually use their languages in real life. So it's based on how people live. Based off of that, it's created into a theory that serve as a set of explanations for language practices on how we include, you've probably heard this phrase, a single linguistic repertoire, or a mental grammar that is fluid and interconnected, that bilinguals and multilinguals have access to all the time. Of course, we can utilize that in our teaching, but it's also an ideology we may have varying degrees of agreement with that come out in our practices and pedagogy in the classroom. Last, and some would say is most often forgotten, perhaps in many professional development, is that translanguaging is also a political project where the goal of translanguaging pedagogy is not just to learn language, not just to affirm identities, though those are undoubtedly important. It's ultimately about working for racialized bilinguals' wholeness and freedom. So they have the agency, they have the tools to create the worlds and the communities they want to be a part of. So what makes translanguaging different than code switching or other bilingual theories is that it takes what some refer to as a post-structural view of languaging. It's just about not language as an item, but language as practices. Also, because it's based off of social reality, it's focusing on people and context. Just what do they do? How do they use their language features? And there's a specific emphasis on flexibility outside of monolingual nation states, standardization and curricularization. So what do we mean by that? So it's not looking at things in terms of this is English, this is Spanish, I'm saying this in English, and now I'm saying in Espanol. I'm not thinking about these social histories that are connected to two nation states. Instead, I'm thinking of myself and my context. I'm just languaging. I'm just interacting right now. What also gets lost in translation, I think sometimes with translanguaging pedagogy, is that it is about honoring languages, but it's also about moving across and beyond languages. Ofelia Garcia is really good to emphasize trans means not just between and across, but beyond languages, so that it's not just about language. It's also about, you see here, language varieties, language voices or genres. It's about gestures, tone. It's about pacing. It's all of these things at the same time that are part of our singular linguistic repertoire. Whenever we define something, I think it's equally as important to talk about what it is as well as what it is not. And I think this, for me, was the major hang-up and why I was initially resistant towards translanguaging pedagogy. I thought it was just code switching. And I knew, and I remembered in my training saying, we do not directly translate things. And like, see my yesterday, you know, like, okay, I got it into my skull. But it's not just code switching or moving between two languages, because they're not fundamentally viewing the practices as two separate languages. It's just my linguistic repertoire. And it's also not comparing bilinguals to monolingual English speakers and monolingual Spanish speakers or other languages. Importantly, it's not positioned as deficient or deviant. So we're not saying your language practices are a problem and we are trying to solve you. Instead of the more humanizing of this is all of who you are, like an emerging bilingual, and we are nurturing and encouraging further development so you can choose how to move forward. It's also not just teaching sin querer. So I remember thinking like, dang it, there's just not as many Spanish materials available, right? And so it's not like, well, I only have the Spanish material, so I'm going to teach us in English, even though it's a Spanish day or Spanish time. And translanguaging pedagogy doesn't mean you don't have protected spaces. Like was mentioned in the chat, there are protected spaces, especially for the minoritized language because of the hegemony of English, or just how English dominates wherever it goes globally. Lastly, it also doesn't mean we don't teach the language features of each language. So it doesn't mean we're not going to teach or be prescriptive with some aspects of English or Spanish or whatever other language. There's still space for that. So for me, I'm like, okay, so this is still here, this is still here, which is why I think this textured understanding, when we go back to the agenda, it said translanguaging plus, because it's this more expanded textured understanding that helps us then work towards equity. Now for real, we're getting to talk some more. In just a moment, we'll be moving into breakout rooms. I think we have a total of 10, but with our number of participants, let's do 6 breakout rooms in just a second. We'll go into 6 breakout rooms and you'll have a time to talk. Please feel free to introduce yourselves if you don't already know each other. And I'd like to give you an opportunity. I'll kind of play it by ear, but we'll start with 6 minutes. Have 6 minutes to talk through what strikes you about the explanation of translanguaging. And then how do these explanations relate to your life in terms of your own language experiences and practices? I already shared with you that this was diametrically opposed. But once I understood, I saw how integrative and healing that it could be to having a positive bilingual identity that I most frankly did not have growing up. Shuling, thanks for letting us know. And then the last question I'd like to invite you to reflect on in our breakout groups in a second is, how do these explanations relate to your life in terms of your students' language practices? So maybe yours are very similar to your students, but I bet there's still important differences. So in our breakout rooms, I'm going to open them. I'm inviting you to go between breakout room 1 through 6. And then we'll have 6 minutes to talk through these 3 questions. Dr. Pignon is awesome to remind us in the chat that once you enter the breakout room, to remember that you have to turn on your camera and your audio. Otherwise, it looks like nobody's there. So again, 6 minutes, the first 6 breakout rooms to talk through these questions, and then we'll come back.
Dr. Babino, are you back in the main room? We can hear you, but we can't see you. I mean, we can see you, but not hear you.
Oh, I've been talking to myself. Okay, so now I think.
Since we came back from the break room. Sorry about that.
No, I'm so glad you told me. So where should I go to?
I think that's where we.
Okay, thank you for your patience. So for why translanguaging? I know a lot of us know this internally, but for those of us that are having to make that justification for leaders that we interact with, why care about translanguaging? Because it's humanizing. It focuses on people and how they use languages. But translanguaging isn't just humanizing, it's also radical because it centers and honors racialized people's marginalized repertoires. So most bilingual and second language acquisition theory focus on elite bilinguals, those that grow up monolingual and are adding a second language, that tend to be from middle and upper classes in the West, where translanguaging theory is centered in birth from marginalized bi and multilingual communities. It also honors the fluid, multicultural and multilingual identities. Like I shared with you, I've always had anxiety as a bilingual, bicultural person. If I had had access to something like this, I would have had something to normalize and integrate who I was and who I could continue to become. Now, we all know we have to account for academics, right? That really is a part of the equity, is having access to the guaranteed curriculum. So translanguaging does lead to increased academic achievement. And some even say that it accelerates or it improves, quote unquote, second language acquisition. So the language myth, people think if you want to learn English, you got to spend more time in English. But no, that's not true, especially when used purposefully. Translanguaging, because it's not just code switching, can help increase academic achievement, citation, and even accelerates or improves, citation, second language acquisition. And then also it focuses on the larger political struggles of students. And so it's humanizing because it's helping them develop that agency in their communities as well. I want to be clear that translanguaging also has challenges, and I would say the field of bilingual research is more and more focusing on how these challenges can be met so that fuller levels of equity can be achieved for students. So like I experienced, translanguaging can be reified or reduced to, it's just code switching. No, it is not just code switching, which I hope you've experienced already so far. We lose the history. We lose the focus on people and context. We lose the robustness, I shouldn't say, that's my favorite word, of the totality of what translanguaging can be and how it can be transformative. We also lose the pedagogical power if we're thinking and applying it just using languages however we want. Also, I think most important to our time today, and even for the field, is that translanguaging pedagogy doesn't always lead to equity for students in schools. Like we've mentioned several times, that's because different contexts lead to variable access to language practices. So some students, let me see, I want to give you credit. Oh, I lost it. Sorry about that. Virginia, I think I wanted to say, legitimately need the standardized forms of Spanish to become a bilingual teacher. So they can't partake in this transformative pedagogy if they can't become a teacher, right? Or students can't have access to higher education or technical education if they don't have certain features of English and Spanish, right? So because of that, they have different educational needs. Particular research has looked at when we just provide open translanguaging time and dual language programs, two-way dual language programs, so two language groups, a lot of times what happens is that it becomes an English dominant space. So what was once meant to provide parity of languages is really just, again, English leakage, right? For those of you teachers, instructional specialists, and leaders, you probably know that from experience. I know even in my family with my daughter, I see that as well. If I just always open it up that way. Also, what is distinctive, why translanguaging doesn't always lead to equity, is because of what Flores and Rosa called the white listening subject, of who was considered the standard language speaker, the quote unquote better language speaker, the quote unquote appropriate language speaker, is usually based on white English monolingual norms of speaking. So that even if a racialized bilingual is using quote unquote appropriate language, because of pernicious racial-linguistic ideologies, they're still graded as deficient. And there have actually been studies that have showed the same recording of a professor, one with an Asian American face and one with a European face, and hundreds of students documented that the Asian American teacher was harder to listen to. The same recording. So translanguaging doesn't convert to the same benefits for everyone, depending on their experiences and their social positioning. Also, when we focus on languages so much, sometimes we don't focus on semiotics or the other modalities. We don't focus on visual representations as much and how those are sophisticated ways of communicating. And of course, if we reify our view of translanguaging, we can forget that it's a political project. It's not just about teaching students language. It's not just about student achievement, though it for sure is at least achievement and at least language practicing. For the sake of time, I think we're going to skip through this one, but we do want to do a dual language check-in, and this is where our next poll is coming into. So we are moving into, like promised, the policies and practices. So I know most of you indicated that you are bilingual and use a combination of your languages in many contexts in daily life. Fantastic. Next, what we're going to look at is what kind of language program are you a part of if you're a teacher, a specialist, or a school leader? Or if you're outside of a district, what are you coming to mind with? And then what is the primary language separation policy? If we have time, we'll do one more. Okay, let's start this one. As you're answering, for me personally, like Dr. Piñon shared, I started off education in a high school Spanish class. I participated in a late exit transitional bilingual program, spent most of my time in a one-way dual language program, and then some of my time in a two-way dual language program. And the good news is that even if it's not explicitly stated in the program type, you can implement varying degrees of translanguaging pedagogy, which I think is super humanizing for us as educators because you get your agency back, right? Even if a program says something distinct, but also when you have in your emboldened with your list of affordances or benefits, you're able to share that with leadership and how making policy and practice change in your bilingual or multilingual program can lead that way. If you were able to attend the morning session, I know Dr. Stewart talked about how to even do this in ESL programs. So you don't have to just be bilingual, and you don't have to be just in a bilingual and more specifically dual language program in order to implement this. So for our 4 ESL friends that are here, you're still in the right place. You can still do this, I promise. All right, so far we're at 17 responses out of, I think, 20-ish something. So we have 4 colleagues that are in some type of transitional bilingual program, 1 in a one-way program, 8 two-way. Ooh, wait, talk about equity issues with two-way programs. You know, if you open up the place, what'll happen, right? And then we have 4 colleagues thinking about an ESL program and how that will respond. Great. Okay, so one more question before we continue and get into the practice. What describes the primary language separation policy? Okay. Super interesting. So we have 15 responses so far. About half of our colleagues with us today have languages that are separated by subject. So it sounds like target language subject, English subject. 1 has languages separated by days or week, which has been my experience. A different, more personalized approach, and then 5 it doesn't apply to. Okay, one last one that isn't here, but nope, changing my mind. We're gonna move forward. Okay, so I'm closing the poll. And that helps us move on. So when we talk about language policies, what do we even mean? It's almost like one of these things like balanced literacy. We say it all the time. But if you really had to define it, like, what does it mean? Language policy, actually looked it up. It's just a set of rules you create for a group of people. So as educators, we are constantly creating rules for groups of people, like our students. And we have these rules for groups of students at our classroom level, but also there might be a grade level discipline policy, school level policies with how you enact your particular bilingual or dual language program, district policies, and of course we experience both the support and the pressure of the state and national policies. We see them both consciously that we're aware of, like saying languages are separated by subjects, and we see them unconsciously when we don't have all the materials in Spanish we need and the decisions we make moving forward. They can be conscious or unconscious, we said. They can be also formal or informal. So it can be this day and this time you're using this language, and then it can be, well, this is what I actually do as a teacher or as a student. And so they're enacted not just by educators, but obviously by leaders and laws at varying levels. And why translanguaging policy is important, a group of rules, whether they're explicit or implicit, is that it's also an ideology or a belief about the language practices of people and how they make rules for their people groups. And ideologies do have a pretty great correlation with the policies we make, the rules we make. And if we look at our rules, we can pretty much get an idea of what some of your ideologies are. But it is also far more complicated than that, because our ideologies come from those system of layers, there's layers of system that we experience, and how in those systems are you positioned as an emerging bilingual English learner? Are you positioned as a quote unquote balanced bilingual? That create the identities that you hold on to. And because you have identities, you then act out your languages in a certain way. I shared with you, like as a Mexican American, I'm like, how can I be a Mexican American that doesn't speak Spanish, right? And so because I wanted that identity, I kept at it and kept at it, right? And even continue today to have certain language policies like in our family at home and in classes. But those identities and language ideologies don't just come de la nada. They come because in our layered systems, we perceive the benefits or variable benefits of our different languages. And we see that as power that we can have and then use as agentic beings in our different contexts. And over the course of your life, we can see, ooh, English has so many benefits. Yes, yes, ándale pues, you know, like, of course, we want our students to learn English. And then students may have variable experiences with the capital that their minoritized language or Spanish brings. Incidentally, because English is so dominant, there's just a necessity for it. We see students use it with their friends all the time. They have monolingual educational context, and there's a need to be invested and have this identity in English. But the good news is that language programs and language classes can increase the perceived benefits, the positive identities of our students so that they can further reinforce their family connections as well as their Spanish or other minoritized language practices. So what once is oppression through resistance of maintaining and even sustaining our languages can continue to grow. So that is the good news. We're here because we want to make the maximum positive impact on our students. And we see, as evident in our polls, that there is a lot in translanguaging that we can leverage, more particularly the policies and practices. We were going to have 10 minutes. I want to ask you as the group, do you want 5 or 10 minutes for our break? You can answer in the chat or even out loud if you want. Okay, 10 is good. Okay, thank you, Susana. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. We're at 2:26. Oops, saying 5. Let's 5. Okay, let's do 7. So we're going to take a 7-minute break. So that means we'll come back at 33. Sorry, Susana, I saw 8. I know, my math, you just saw that. Okay, we're going to take 7 minutes. So we'll come back at 2:33 and really dig in after that. I promise. All right, we are now at 2:33. Hope you've had everything you needed in your 7 minutes break. I promise this will be worth it. You don't want to miss it. So here we are talking about the nitty-gritty of translanguaging policies, in particular language allocation. Hold on 1 second. Okay, I know this is super weird, so I'll be back. I'm sorry, I'm in a meeting right now. No, thank you. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. Okay, so what we see is typical language policies in school systems, whether it be bilingual programs, but more particularly dual language bilingual programs, is that there's an English space and a Spanish space. Sometimes it's the subject, the day of the week, or even teachers. So I participated for most of my career in half of my career in a one teacher, one language. So students had the Spanish teacher for a couple days or a week and an English teacher for a couple days or a week. So everything in the Spanish classroom was only in Spanish. Everything in the English classroom only in Spanish. I know a lot of you may be part of the Gomez and Gomez model of dual language that have specific specifications for what that looks like as well. So I think that still pretty much falls into the typical language allocation. Now, what Sanchez, Escamilla, Garcia, and others talk about is how there can be a language allocation policy that allows us to protect and prioritize the minoritized language. Like, let me see, Eugenia was talking about her students come to school with informal Spanish only. So it's like, yes, they need space for that informal Spanish, and it's an equity issue. They need space to continue to develop other registers of Spanish, right? And so there can be distinct spaces for English, for Spanish, but then you'll see what we'll talk through over the next couple slides, and we'll get to start practicing together, is that it has these distinct places, but it also has what's called translanguaging rings, a purposeful pedagogical use of translanguaging. But it doesn't just stop there. There's also a very demarcated emphasis on translanguaging documentation, on how, well, first, what data do we collect in what languages, and then how that informs the spaces we have, as well as the translanguaging rings, in order for it to truly lead to transformation for students. And for transformation, we mean, yes, at least linguistic and academic, but it is so much more, because it's identities, communities, and ultimate equity for communities. So what does this look like in practice? Let's pretend, mis amigos, we are in a second grade Spanish instruction space. Maybe it's the subject, maybe it's the day or the teacher, right? So we have a Spanish space. So most of our work is going to be in Spanish. Maybe even the target deliverables are also in Spanish. But we're going to use what you see here is translanguaging rings. What does that look like? Well, in this class, it's more specifically talking about science. They are focusing on identifying and contrasting habitats for different animals. And to help develop that, they're going to read an article, listen to a video, discuss and write their thinking with a partner on a foldable, right? And so what we can do with translanguaging to accelerate growth is to look at the language profiles of students. I think about half of you said you're part of two-way programs. So I tried to have examples of two different typical language groups that you may have. So our first one, Jose, has been in dual language since pre-K. He speaks mostly Spanish at home, like Eugenia talked about, coming in with the informal register of Spanish. He tends to speak Spanish with his friends in second grade. He reads on a second grade level in Spanish and a first grade level in English. For those of you familiar with Kathy Escamilla's work, he's in the biliteracy zone. So his two language proficiencies aren't too different from each other. And when we look at his TELPAS, if you're coming from Texas, his English language proficiency assessment, he's considered an advanced, well, that's not TELPAS, sorry. If you look at his oral language, he's an advanced Spanish speaker and an intermediate Spanish writer. So that may sound like some of your students, right? Maybe more looking like Spanish dominant. Then we have Janice, a Black student who is learning Spanish as a second language, who's also been in dual language since kindergarten. She speaks English at home, but has the full support of Spanish from her parents through their encouragement. She speaks some Spanish with her friends at school, but mostly English. Contrasting with Jorge, she reads at a second grade level in English and a first grade level in Spanish. So her English is a little bit higher than her Spanish, but like Escamilla would say, she's in the biliteracy zone, just a little bit of difference. And though her reading, there's not a big gap in her abilities, you probably see this with quote unquote second language learners, right? That the speaking is a little less developed than the reading. So she's only a beginning Spanish speaker, but intermediate Spanish writer. So her written modalities, the reading and writing, are a little bit more advanced than her oral language, where Jorge is a little bit more advanced in his oral language than he is in reading and writing. So what does this look like to have a translanguaging policy that has separate places for English and Spanish instruction? We are in Spanish instruction, and we want to use the specific policy of translanguaging rings to provide that support for each student. Well, first we got to talk about what translanguaging rings are, and I totally forgot that. I'm sorry. So when we talk about rings, it's rings of support, or that individual support that we provide each student to help them grow linguistically to the next level within their zone of proximal development. So what meets them where they're at and helps them move a little bit more, whether it be in listening, speaking, reading, or writing. So this is kind of the whole situation. Spanish time using translanguaging rings. So what does it look like? Well, according to Garcia and some other colleagues, they say, what is your primary goal? Right now, we are in a science classroom. Some teachers would say the primary goal is to learn the science standard, and the secondary goal is to develop both of the languages. At this time, to develop Spanish academic language, right? So first we want the content in this instance, and second we want the language. This is how translanguaging can help accelerate content achievement. So they're having to identify and contrast the habitats. They're listening or reading an article, listening to a video, talking and writing. How can we support each student? Like Eugenia said, some students are coming with a variety of Spanish registers, even if they're quote unquote Spanish dominant. So they still need rings of support to help them grow in their Spanish and English. So just like the objective says, both of them will, Jorge would read and listen in Spanish because he's orally dominant in Spanish, and this is Spanish time. He'll probably discuss his thinking with a partner, mostly Spanish, may use some English. So that's a little translanguaging ring, is that support. And as he's writing out on his hoja plegable, he's probably going to utilize that quote unquote academic Spanish word bank and sentence stems to help him to continue to grow in that academic Spanish register. So even though he's Spanish dominant, he's still taking use of translanguaging to deepen his content knowledge, but also extend his language development even in his dominant language. Now, for our two-way friends, you're like, but what do I do? I know this is a constant battle. This is constantly, especially in the early childhood grades, challenging. What do we do for what may be English dominant students sometimes? For Janice, first to get her started, we may anchor her in English. So help her look at these and find cognates. Identificaré y contrastaré. Like, okay, Janice, parecen algunas palabras en inglés. ¿Cómo? ¿Cuáles son? And then, okay, what other words do you, oh, habitat, okay, that's a cognate. And so to talk her through that, to build the background knowledge to connect to her academic Spanish. She may also still read and watch the video in Spanish. We know her oral language is a little less developed than her reading. And so the reading can reinforce what she watched, which is why we have two modalities here. And we may work to, and she may discuss it in English. So she's like, I listened to it in Spanish. I'm developing my content knowledge and my Spanish knowledge right here. But to process it, I just need to speak in English. My daughter is also a simultaneous bilingual, but is for sure English. So what does this do? It helps scaffold content. They're able to learn the content more deeply. And also, just as importantly, they're able to scaffold language development. So we're not having to sacrifice content or sacrifice language development. Because for me, that's also an equity issue if they don't have the opportunity to develop other forms of each language, whether that be English or Spanish or another language. They're also able to focus on their strengths, whether that be speaking and listening like Jorge or reading and writing like Janice. And ultimately, what's the goal? We want them to learn the content, and we still maintain the content objective the entire time. And we also still mostly honored the target language the whole time. The deliverable was still in Spanish. The students still both were able to grow in their minoritized language. So when we were looking at this policy, I want to make sure you see it all together, we talked about how we can have specific spaces for each one, because that's an equity issue, but we provide them with translanguaging rings. Next, we'll talk about translanguaging documentation and how that informs everything we do in our spaces with the support, and that ultimately leads for transformation for our students. So by documentation, first, just like at its core, translanguaging pedagogy is focused on people and their realities, and it's humanizing. So it is taking an asset perspective. What can they do? Let's document. What can they do within their languages, but as well as across their languages? And this is particularly important, especially if in your dual language program you separate by subject, is talking about their language domain development. Because even if they have, like many programs, all of their math instruction in English, they may perform even better in Spanish, but they need that bridge, right, in order to make it there. Some districts in their curriculum leadership create benchmarks that are available partially in both languages. So what that looks like is you have maybe a Unit 5 assessment in second grade math, right? Let's talk about two standards. One standard has 3 questions in English, 3 questions in Spanish. Another standard has 3 questions in English and 3 questions in Spanish. They're still assessing all of the content, but they're additionally assessing the content in the languages to see, do students, are they struggling with the content or the standard, or is their language also playing, or their comprehension playing a factor here? And that provides great evidence in order to see students' full assets and what they're able to do and move towards more equitable decision making when it comes even to an inequitable test like STAR. I realize that takes a whole lot of planning and development. In my own practice, our district had an entire curriculum department that worked on that. And so if you're like, we don't have that where I am, I think you could still pick a unit or work with a team of bilingual teachers, or even work with your curriculum at the district level in order to pick a couple units that you practice that with, or even divide the labor to do that. Now, this one sounds so easy and obvious, but I think is equally transformative, and that is documenting with student conferences. I'll show you an example of what that looks like, but I wanted to make sure for later you had access to this link, and in the slides I think you'll have access to it. If not, you can email me, and I include my email at the end, of more robust, my favorite word, ways to document using translanguaging policy. But just using a super simple one, one example is, like many of us have a Google Sheets with all of our students and probably their scores, right? And so I may have the students' scores with Yashida, por ejemplo, in English speaking, listening, reading, and writing, all her different levels. But I also include all of her Spanish abilities. And this can be based on your informal observation, or if your district and school has formal assessments. In Spanish, speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Now, here is what can really be helpful, is seeing not just their general language proficiencies in each language, but also seeing their performance in the content areas. So if your district or your school or classroom chooses to implement a benchmark with some of it in English and some in Spanish, you can see how they perform, if it's different between the languages or pretty equal. So I show an example with English math, Spanish math. For Yashida, she's achieving pretty much similarly in both languages. But when it comes to Yashida's science in English and Spanish, she masters or scores significantly higher when it's in English, probably because she had a lot of her instruction in English, but her Spanish is meeting. So depending on the goals of your school, under the table and over the table, they might want to be like, well, she's going to go all to English next year, so let's have her take it in English, you know, or think about which one she might score higher in. And the part I intimated before that I think seems easy but can be transformative is having a conference with her about her scores. So I would normally have, like, what's it called, like assessment conferences with students and say, hey, like, this is what you scored. Do you feel like this is a representation of what you know? And we would talk about how they experienced the assessment and how they felt about their language understanding. As you can imagine, some students may feel that like societal pressure of like English is cooler. All the smart kids are moving towards English, so they may want to move forward and take an assessment in English, even if it's not their stronger language. But I've found that when you have continual conversations about being an integrated bilingual, using translanguaging policy, you can help them move through that to really think of themselves individually as a bilingual and how they want to use their agency to turn the test around on them, to make it work for them so that they can do their best. So when we implement something like this class-wide, grade level-wide, or even school-wide, we're able to see within each language how students are performing, but also across content areas. Then when we add the punch of having conferences, we're affirming not only their identity, but also their agency to use language and language practices for their own means, even in totally inequitable contexts. So when we put it all together, we're doing this in order for transformation, in order for students to have increased agency, which includes having space to grow in both of their codified languages. So opening this up just for the group before we move forward, what, if any, of these policies do you already use? Do you use translanguaging documentation? Do you use translanguaging rings? And then what are you interested in implementing? You can share out loud. Oh, thank you, Dr. Pignon. She included the other examples of the translanguaging documentation in the chat. Okay, I see a response, but I'm not sure what in reference to. Which of these policies do you already use? Maybe none of them. I didn't want to assume either way. You can come off the mic, you can write in the chat. Maybe you need time to reflect, or maybe you're just tired. It's been a good long day. All right. Thank you, Maria. So she's saying she wants to help each of her students do their best in the way they need, independently of the day or the subject. So yes, to honor the student, and I think we can honor the student by giving them access to the language tools, to the content, and then to growing their proficiencies. And then Susana's saying, I've not used this before, but I would like to use them and provide a space for translanguaging in my classroom. Yes, and we'll talk about how you can start, because I don't know about you, but seeing this, I remember being super overwhelmed, like, oh, but my program is structured this way, like, how can I begin doing that? Okay, so we talked about policies. We can use separate places with translanguaging rings. We can use translanguaging documentation. Those are some quote unquote easy ways to get started that are a policy or a rule. The good news is we can also plan practices or ways we teach that are even more systematic. So whether it be a week unit or a multiple weeks unit, we can plan these different practices. Probably one of the old standbys in bilingual pedagogy is something that's deceptively easy, but I think can really be leveraged to make even greater impact for students. And that is the preview review. So like for Susana or for Maria y los demás, if you are in the Spanish time of the day, but you're wanting to help Jorge and Janice, and you know that they have these different assets and development across their languages, it's still a Spanish time. We can begin the section by talking through the translations of words, pointing out which ones are cognates. We can also highlight special language features. Did you know this? So I don't know about you, but as wonderful and fantastic as my district experiences have been, there's been a whole lot of different information I've learned about bilingual pedagogy in other places. And one of these is creating that third space for translanguaging. That's not explicitly one language or the other, like this one that we're talking about here. Later, I don't know if you have access, I also have it on the resources here later, Kathy Escamilla's and her colleagues, Biliteracy from the Start. I feel like that changed my whole world. She says that up to 25% of our instructional time, let me say that again, 25% of our instructional time should be focused on meta-linguistic connections, like making connections between languages. And I remember thinking, like, my directora no me dijo, you know, like, we're not allowed to do that. But this is a great place to help them develop that meta-linguistic awareness or that complex understanding in each of their languages and across their languages. And so this would be a great time to talk about like the direct cognates, how lots of times in Spanish we have the adjective after the noun. We've got a lot of cognates here, the accents, why we have them, the cognates, but also the amigos falsos or the false cognates as well. And then over each lesson throughout the week or throughout the unit, whether it's an official English or official Spanish time, you can keep reviewing it. And sometimes you may have students at the beginning of the lesson focus all on making those language connections. The next day, you may have that conversation in the target language, in this situation, Spanish. The next day, you may have them do a quick review in English, even though it's official Spanish time, as they continue to build on that. So again, this is a really typical bilingual pedagogy, which is why I included it. And also, if you feel so constrained by the language policies in your particular program, you can still explicitly interweave it in your classroom or at your grade level. So this is supposed to be an easy win. But most importantly, I would say, is that we want to move it beyond our individual classrooms, right? Like, it's great if we're able to start in our classroom, and I don't want to poo-poo on that at all. But we know we want all of our students to benefit from that. So we can write it into our grade level curriculum if you plan that way. Your entire school, especially for our instructional specialists that are here and those other school leaders that are outside the district, but also with district partnerships, whether you're inside or outside the district, to talk about how we can plan our entire curriculum, not just the classroom, to have these times interwoven. And the guide that Dr. Piñón shared in the chat gives a couple of examples of what a curriculum guide looks like that is created that way. Okay, so we're gonna do, our time just went by so fast. I'm looking at the time and it's almost 3 o'clock. So I want to respect your time. So I want to go through another one of the practices, and I'll make sure you have access to the slides. So another translanguaging practice you can use, and you may have practiced with this already, is así se dice, or that's how you say it. The goal is to create a short passage and work in pairs with your students to translate that. And we know translation is not easy because we're looking at not just the words, but also the sentence structure. And then we're looking at the words and the sentence structure as well as phrases and the idea. So we were going to go in breakout rooms. I'm so sorry. Thankfully, Dr. Piñon has a whole session tomorrow. We all focus on the action plan. And so in this activity, the teacher shares a sentence in pairs or groups, try to translate it. And when we look at the word level, like le exige, we see that students understand and translate it differently. So the first group said he told le exige, the other one said he commanded. Another pairing said he demands, and another he tells. So that would be a great part of that metalinguistic awareness that you create through cross language connections of le exige. Is it really just tells? Because that would be like le dice, you know. What is the difference between le exige and maybe command, like mandarle, you know? Oh, thank you. So Dr. Piñon in the chat is saying that she's sharing a Padlet with the CUNY translation guides. Thank you, thank you, thank you. She's the best. This is why we work together, right? And so we can see in this practice, you could implement once a week, every other week. The important part is systematizing it so they regularly engage in these practices. And you can see it can just be a sentence. Again. Last one, super quick, and then we'll close our time for today, is the practice el dictado. And I don't know if you've experienced this in your own education, but can be super powerful because of how it allows students to learn multiple features of academic language at the same time, like word study and spelling, but also former fourth grade bilingual writing teacher here, the capitalization, punctuation, and grammar differences in English and Spanish, but also vocabulary and comprehension. So in kindergarten, this can just be a simple sentence or a couple words. And at third grade and up, it can be 3 sentences or more. So an example is the teacher introduces it. She focuses, see what students are able to write. Create a mini lesson, have students practice, and they keep, oh yes, Dr. Piñon said she loves doing dictado as a first grade teacher. So powerful and quick assessment check, yes. So again, an example of dictado here, lots more resources because there's always more things to learn than the time we have. So what we will do is when you get to meet with Dr. Piñon on our last session, I'd like to invite you to think about what practices you're already using, but to also make it super accessible, what are you interested in trying and systematizing? So really using the preview review, you know, during your time, or implementing así se dice, el dictado, throughout the next semester or even 9 weeks, so that you can reflect not only on your current practices, but how your current practices can be enhanced and your students' needs can be more fully met through practices like these. Of course, I am a realist. I can never get that out of me. I realize English hegemony is fierce, and especially around testing time, it's like, well, everyone, or a lot of times, a lot of people feel the pressure to teach more in English. We have the mono mainstream assumption that's not implementing bi, multi, and trans perspectives. A lot of it driven by that high stakes testing, right? We talked about our strict separation policies and how, we didn't say this yet, but there's white or Anglo normativity of what the good language sounds like. All of these are barriers, but they don't have to stop us in being those agentive change makers for our students. And no matter what program we are, to still implement policies and practices in our own classrooms. So I realize we've talked through a whole lot, but this can just be another beginning, right? So if you'd like to talk more, totally feel free to reach out. Have my email here, my Twitter handle here, and you'll definitely get to do more with Dr. Pignon tomorrow. Anything else before we leave? Feel free to come off mute or share it in the chat. Another beginning, yes. Thank you, Susana y los demás. I appreciate it. All right, thank you, thank you. Again, doesn't have to be it. Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Babino, for
welcome.
packed presentation on policies and practices for translanguaging. I hope you're able to take a little bit of what you've learned, and maybe you're going to implement one piece, or maybe you're going to, redo your language program. Whatever it is, we're here to help and support you, and we're glad that you came out today to listen to us. I hope you join us tomorrow morning to see Dr. Susana Ibarra, and she's one of the authors of the Translanguaging Classroom. And then we'll do a recap in the afternoon when you're able to think about what you might be doing and take it out into your district or your school or even your classroom. So I hope you join us, and we're here if you have any questions, and feel free to join IDRA.org. We have wonderful newsletters that come out all the time, and we'd love to help you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias, Dr. Babino. It was wonderful.
My pleasure.